Since his disappearance in 2010, Alan Wake has been trapped inside the dark place, alone with only a flashlight and a pistol. The Bureau found a typewritten page slipped under the spiral door in the ocean view that was signed by the author, in which he describes his time inside. Within that decade-long imprisonment, Alan had many adventures, most of which remain completely unknown. He mentions sending out smoke signals, but the nature of this is unknown. With the exception of the events from the Signal and Rider DLC, there is only one other story we know during this time. That would be the events of American Nightmare. Roughly 2 years into his imprisonment, Alan is caught up in a new manuscript of his own creation. In a quick summary, there is a signal received by Dr. Rachel Meadows that contains information to help Alan defeat the Herald of Darkness, Mr. After finding out, the demon tampered with the machinery so only fractions of the signal could be seen. While trapped in a time loop, the writer little by little finds more of the message until he has the recipe to rewrite the world and take Mr. out of it. Please see my previous Alan Wake video for additional details. In short, this was achieved because Alice Wake showed the world the man she knew with her film, Sunrise.
Look, all that stuff really gets blown out of proportion. He had his problems, but it's really frustrating for me because people like to talk. They love to tell these crazy stories, and they never really knew him at all.
The story of American Nightmare takes place within the fictional town of Night Springs and concludes with Alan meeting up with Alice and sharing a kiss by the sunrise. But did this really happen? This game has been described by the developers as a standalone spin-off, and as such, some have questioned if the story should even be considered canon. Because of Control, we know that about 7.5 years after this story, Alan is still in the dark place and unable to break free. With this in mind, the image we see of Alan escaping the dark place at the end of American Nightmare couldn't have happened, could it? Based upon the evidence I'm going to present, I would argue it did in fact happen for real. This is a personal hypothesis, so I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on the topic as well.
Night Springs doesn't exist. It's a fictional town from the TV show I used to work on. It was Any Place USA, a place we used as a backdrop for whatever strange story we had that week.
Night Springs is a fictional town that is the center point of the story. It is based upon a TV series of the same name that Alan once wrote a few episodes for.
Now Night Springs is in Arizona, although not for long. It's in Arizona because whatever the town that has become Night Springs is really called is located near one of the thin, worn places in the world where dreams and reality flow together and life is always a little strange.
Bright Falls was a little weird because of its proximity to the lake. This town, which I shall call Desert Shore, is a place of power as well, due to its proximity to the oil derricks. For the purposes of his story, Alan reshaped that town into Night Springs and slipped out briefly to enter his creation. Within the Arizona desert, Night Springs would manifest like an oasis sprouting to cover Desert Shore with Alan's creation. As soon as the story concluded, Night Springs would recede back into the dark place, leaving Desert Shore intact. We see the same dynamic occur when Barbara Jagger manifested Diver's Isle and Bird's Lake Cabin at the start of the main game. As soon as its purpose was served, it vanished. I am curious, however, if Desert Shore has caused other AWE events in the past, or will cause more in the future.
It's not so much a story as it is a sort of an echo, showing us how you saw your husband at the time. It's not really about the sunrise itself or Alan watching it. It's about you two together.
I suppose. It's funny looking at it now, especially now that it's been edited like that. It takes on a life of its own almost. It's a kind of a fantasy.
I used to know where fiction ends and reality begins. Here, they're all the same. It's a hideous trap, my every thought made real. Fear, desire. How can I ever know for sure I've escaped and not just lost in my own fantasy of it? That thought alone can drive you insane.
Alice refers to the Sunrise film as a fantasy of hers, and Alan specifically states that he can never be sure if he ever really escaped from the dark place or was simply trapped in a fantasy of it. A fantasy is defined as a pleasant situation or event that you want to happen and enjoy thinking about, especially one that is unlikely to really happen. We all fantasize about things we want to happen. The images we see in our heads are real in a certain sense. Just like Fantastica from the Neverending Story is a world of human fantasy, our imagination is real, just existing on a different tier of reality than the one we live in. Ask anyone who spends time reading fiction. Sometimes the world, the characters, and the history of a book take on a life of their own and are real in their eyes.
Stories come naturally to us. We can't help it. There are many different worlds, many competing realities within our heads, fueled by books, television, even barely remembered childhood tales. There's an endless supply of fictional concepts more familiar to us than anything or anyone real. We have a far greater connection to the fictional characters we know and love than the random people we pass on the street. Our destinies and inspirations are shaped by lies, myths, and fables.
However, the fantasies in our heads can never be brought into this objective reality until we take action. We imagine ourselves getting the job, but it takes effort on our part to make that really happen. We fantasize about a story in our heads, but until we put pen to paper, it will only ever exist within the reality in our minds. The ending of the game, showing Alan reuniting with Alice, was just that, a fantasy. A reality that was formed and experienced by the writer, but only within the confines of his prison. Alan mentioned that he had sent out smoke signals into the objective reality. What exactly would this look like? We know that aspects of him can be seen all throughout Quantum Break, but for the purposes of American Nightmare, the smoke signal hits closer to home. As previously discussed, a fantasy is a world we create in our minds. But there is another type of fantasy that we have all experienced at one point or another. That would be dreams. The world of a dream is a reality of fantasy and allows our inner voice to speak to us through the use of personal symbolism. Please refer to the Alan's Nightmare video for more details on this. If Alan can create realities from his dark cell, it is feasible to assume that he can create dreams as well. When discussing Mr. We spoke of daemon spirits. One such entity was Morpheus, the spirit of dream. He was a messenger who, on behalf of the gods, carried specific dreams and planted them in the minds of the sleeper. The story of American Nightmare began with Barry Wheeler on tour with the old gods of Asgard and passing out in a motel. He falls asleep watching reruns of Night Springs, and Alan's smoke signal, the reality he created in American Nightmare, was planted into his dream. It is my hypothesis that even as Alan struggled in the Arizona desert, Barry was dreaming of the entire event happening. Alan's manuscript, whether by intention or accident, created a dream for his best friend, or more accurately, a nightmare. After the sunrise, the episode of Night Springs is over, and Barry wakes up, the dream having ended. He calls out for Alan, convinced he heard the voice of his lost friend. At the end of the day, yes, the events of American Nightmare really happened, but only as Alan's fantasy in Barry's nightmare. The objective reality is the one we can touch and taste, the one we live in, but the worlds we imagine in our minds can be just as real. It simply requires us on the outside to take action and bring these fantasies into the objective reality. The dark presence was unable to free itself and required help from a creator on the outside to form the crack and bring the scratching hag through. Alan's strife parallels this. He is unable to free himself while trapped inside the prison. The manuscript for the story within American Nightmare is entitled Return. In another town, a woman named Samantha finds the cover page of Return within a shoebox located in her attic. On that page, in Alan's own handwriting, he wrote of Campbell's monomyth and the hero's journey. Within the return phase, the 14th step of the hero's journey is entitled Rescue from Without. To quote, "Sometimes the hero will require aid from a third party in order to return home from the realm of the supernatural. The hero indeed may need to be rescued himself." Luckily, the Bureau has a new director, and the investigation sector, which contains all research on the Bright Falls Altered World event, is soon to be opened. It appears the third party will be Director Faden, and it is my hope that during the AWE DLC, she will be the rescue from without, and finally return the lost hero.
This act of creation is exhilarating and frightening. Subtext and symbols loom eager to take effect. Causality and consequence become domino chains that stretch into infinity. The more fundamental the change, the more unpredictable the variables become. Reality is too complex to control completely. Ordinary questions become meaningless. Who created who? What is really real? Everything is as real as everything else. You learn to let go of the things you can't control and go with the flow, or go insane.